Here too.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, Riley.
And Kesha, I think I just made you a co-host.
Oh,
I don't
great.
know if you can see that.
I know I can share my screen if that's helpful.
Yes, that's what I'm looking for. Great.
So Kesha, first order of business, how do we pronounce your name?
Oh, fun one.
Kesha, Kesha,
Kesha, like Croatia. Ram, I used to say like CD-ROM, but with young people, they don't know what that is. And sometimes I say Ram Emanuel, but again, with young people, they don't always know who that is. So I have to figure out something new. And then Hinsdale. I hope that helps.
Thanks, that was helpful. Yep.
Well, I wanted to get us started on time tonight because we've really got some fabulous information to cover. And I just want to thank everyone so much for joining this event that is being sponsored by Richmond Racial Equity and the Richmond Climate Action Committee. Tonight's discussion is about police accountability and environmental justice. And we are very pleased to welcome Senator Kesha Ram-Hinsdale, who is the lead sponsor of legislation about these important topics, currently before our representatives in Montpelier. But before we get started, I did want to turn the floor over to Emily Mitchell, who is going to do a land acknowledgement for us tonight.
Hi, everybody. So tonight's land acknowledgement is going to be a little bit, maybe not your conventional land acknowledgement. So I'm excited to share that Richmond's own Radiate Art Space recently accepted a proposal from Scott Silverstein and Alexis Latham, and I'm sure other people that I don't know about or I'm forgetting, so apologize. The murals at the town center windows that go around the base of the building will celebrate the Abenaki and Indigenous peoples' contributions to our community. Richmond Racial Equity will be partnering with the Vermont Abenaki Artists Association in this project, and paintings will depict modern Abenaki persons using technologies and performing activities in a traditional style like birch bark canoes, which are still made and used. They'll show the Abenaki origin of many of the practices essential to Vermont culture, like sugaring and snowshoes, as well as ideas about democracy and social equity that were planted in the minds and hearts of European settlers by the example of the Indigenous people here. The panels will also introduce Western Abenaki language words with translation to serve as an educational component. So these murals are going to be painted sometime in late April or early May. Obviously, nature has a part in that story there, and welcome volunteers who would like to join us on this project, especially artists who would like to help paint. So please, I will in a couple minutes put some emails in the chat of whom you can reach out to if you're interested in participating in that. And we are super excited to have this be the next set of murals on our town building. So thanks.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Emily. And just a little bit of housekeeping. Before I hand the floor to the senator, I'd like to remind folks to stay muted unless you're speaking. The senator's only with us for about 30 minutes. So we're going to hold our own introductions until after her presentation and time for questions. But we would love for folks to put their name, their town, if you're affiliated with a group, and an email contact address, if you'd like to share that in the chat so that we can keep track of folks who are here. And we also invite you to stay on after the senator needs to hop off to make connections and have further discussion and hopefully plan next steps with the information that we're going to hear about tonight. I believe that we have people here representing Williston, Heinsberg, Jericho, and Waterbury, as well, of course, as my fellow Richmond residents. So now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Senator Ram-Hinsdale.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Patty. Thank you to the whole group. I recognize a lot of familiar faces. I see some new faces. I see Representative Jana Brown, who's been a great thought partner on a lot of these fronts. And so if people, have questions, I hope you'll also introduce yourself as well as you ask your question, then I can get to know more folks. And I am going to share my screen. I feel like usually I'm not a PowerPoint person, but when it comes to Zoom, it's just something nicer to look at, I think, and stay focused on. So it's just a privilege to be here with all of you. As the first woman of color in the state Senate and only the second woman of color who was elected to the Vermont House, these are issues that I've worked on for over a decade. When we talk about environmental justice, particularly, that was my senior thesis in 2007. Pat Brown, who's here from Williston, may remember that. He was also my advisor when I was student body president, and I was simultaneously, helping to lead the student body and working on traveling the state and hearing the stories of so many Vermonters who were experiencing acute health issues, were places where we had cancer clusters, disparities that we were seeing even in our green and beautiful state. It's also, I bring with me experiences growing up around the Los Angeles Police Department. And some of you may have seen some op-eds I've written about being arrested at the age of 13 and essentially racially profiled as quote unquote Mexican before any other questions were asked, and arrested for a majority of the night before we were able to call our parents or, get any help of any kind. So these experiences are really personal for me. And I just want to say that before I go deep into the wonkiness, because, I love talking about the details of bills, but I really value what you all do, because you are personalizing issues that deeply impact, majority people of color or people from marginalized communities. And we need that. We need people who are doing the work you're doing of putting your own time, and input and reputations on the line to fight for others. So I've been following you all for a long time as a big fan, and it truly is a privilege to be here with all of you. So the Environmental Justice Bill, S-148, has passed out of the Senate. And I feel, I'm going to say this now because it's in slight contrast to some of the other bills, but I feel really good about the form in which it passed out of the Senate. It received a lot of input from frontline communities, from BIPOC affinity spaces. And I was part of a project called Rejoice, which is around rural environmental justice research between UVM, Vermont Law School, the Center for Whole Communities, and other organizations, where we traveled to places like Newport and Rutland. Folks may know Newport has the highest energy poverty in the state, where people spend the most of their income on fuels and particularly heating their homes. And Rutland has the highest asthma rate in the state. It experiences a lot of blight, as people may know and appreciate. They are doing such an incredible job bringing art and rehabbing buildings. But, these are the kinds of places we're talking about as well. I obviously could look around and see a lot of issues in places like Burlington and Winooski, particularly for multilingual language learners and for renters, for example. But I just want to make it clear, we're talking about mobile home communities, people experiencing geographic isolation, people who don't have transportation to go far distances. We're talking about a lot of rural white Vermonters as well, who experience environmental injustice. The two images that I've chosen to share are from the aftermath of Tropical Storm Irene. And as people may remember, we had so many waterlogged mobile homes. And I shared this statistic on the floor as well. When Tropical Storm Irene hit the state, 8% of our population lived in mobile or manufactured homes, but they were 40% of the victims of flooding. So, this environmental justice has a lot to do with not only where people can find and afford to locate, but how they do or do not recover from natural disasters. When we traveled the state, we heard lingering trauma from people about being left behind in Tropical Storm Irene, and this was a decade later. The other image is, of course, of the Milk with Dignity campaign, led by Migrant Justice and our farm worker community. And environmental justice is not just about locations, but workplaces and people who may not have access to a washing machine where they work 6 days a week, and having to sleep potentially in clothes that are hazardous to their health, or experience other workplace health hazards. And so environmental justice encompasses a broad range of the kinds of health hazards and exposures and lack of resources that people might face that change their environmental health outcomes. We also know that in the pandemic, Black Vermonters in October of the first year of the pandemic were 10 times more likely to have a COVID-19 infection than white Vermonters. And that was before the outbreak in farm worker housing around Champlain orchards that affected Jamaican farm workers. So there have been huge disparities, and all I've said in the press is we should attack every disparity with the same honesty and integrity that we are the COVID-19 disparities that we uncovered, because they are all there. And that is a big piece of this bill, is data and interpreting the data with the help of an advisory group made up of people from frontline communities and the most impacted communities, as well as having a interagency working group that's made up of the leaders of a lot of agencies. This is not just an A&R issue. It took us everything we had just to get A&R and the Department of Health to talk to each other. And, these are agencies that need to talk to each other if we're going to close disparities that have a lot to do with neighborhoods that are unhealthy or unsafe, or people who lack access to transportation, you name it. So it names a lot of the agencies that need to work closer to look at these disparities. It has definitions that speak specifically to accumulation of burden of pollution, defines environmental burden and environmental benefit, because then you can further define environmental justice as having an overabundance of burdens and a lack of benefits. And we just tend to see that lack of benefit concentrated in lower income communities and communities of color. Finally, it tries to use that data to get us up to speed with a mapping tool. A mapping tool is very basic for a lot of states doing environmental justice work. It helps you not only show where's their heat vulnerability or flooding vulnerability or Superfund sites, for example, and how are those co-located with marginalized and civil rights protected communities. It also might help you say, you know what? We don't have any electric vehicle charging stations in these communities. We haven't gotten them any of the benefits either. So you're trying to map not just those burdens, but California particularly has done a good job saying, 15% of new electric vehicle charging stations or other environmental amenities have to go in these low-income neighborhoods. And that kind of mapping, keeps a lot of the guesswork out and keeps us from recreating old patterns. And by the way, the federal government is finally onto this as well. And there's a provision in Build Back Better that might make it into other bills that pass around infrastructure called Justice 40 that requires that 40% of the dollars for infrastructure and investment go to the most marginalized and under-resourced communities who never have received their share of that investment prior. How do I quickly say this? I am worried about the sweater unraveling in the House. I'm not trying to look at Jana, the House Natural Resources Committee has said, what if we just use the EPA definition, which is 25 years old? And a lot of other states have done a good job giving us new language and new iterations to borrow from, everything from that to why does this need a $500,000 appropriation? And, so we have tried to stress that this bill was written as an environmental justice policy should, with the meaningful participation of those most impacted, and starting to pull away the language and say, why do we have this? Why do we need that? Really takes agency away from the people who've never felt like part of the environmental movement before, and it sets us back. So I have shared that with the Committee of Jurisdiction, House Natural Resources and Energy. And if others can as well. And really we'll keep working with VPIRG and others to come up with clear language. And I've said, like, I will let Conservation Law Foundation and others do internal work before I call out for people like you to help us, with some kind of action to make sure that the bill stays relatively intact in the way that, a lot of communities who are impacted had it written and addressed. S250, I'll try to be, quick about this. It's it started out as a bigger bill, kind of a manifesto of sorts for me about, ways to work out policing accountability, oversight, reform, 21st century policing, whatever you want to call it, in ways that I know the best of law enforcement, the ones who are really working on accountability already, are standards where they're already trying to hold themselves. And so I, believe it or not, I've worked on a lot of policing legislation. I didn't get significant pushback on this. I do think some pieces were watered down that I find concerning. And there are those working to rebuild them as more than studies in the House. And, I think that's worthy work to pursue. I, felt we ran out of time and this wasn't given enough time. It was an 8-piece bill. And, my chair in the last 2 days before our crossover, when the bills have to leave the Senate for the House, said, okay, well, let's take this up. And I did my best, but I think with a little more testimony, we'll see that some of these pieces can be implemented rather than studied. So first of all, it does ask for expansion of data collection and reporting by law enforcement. Right now, a majority of the data collection comes from the state police, and the data collection that is beyond the state police and includes local law enforcement is all around roadside stops. It is not about all encounters. It does not include all demographic information like disability status, and it does not highlight, which I think is important, use of force that might result in injury or death. We are not collecting that information in a standard way. We have the commitment from our Commissioner of Public Safety that they are working on standardizing that, not just with the state police, but across all law enforcement. And the first piece of the bill encourages them to move quickly in that direction and to check in with us about how that is going annually. The second piece is really important. And this is why, I just felt like I'm going to, get things under the radar that people don't realize how important and valuable they are. But this is essentially what's called a Giglio registry. And we argued a lot about how to pronounce it. Some people say Giglio. And I tried to listen to the Supreme Court case. So the Giglio registry, based on a Supreme Court case, is the idea that someone who takes the witness stand needs to be credible and honest. And if there's any question about their credibility or honesty, that needs to be disclosed to the defense. The really important piece of a Giglio registry is that it applies to law enforcement first and foremost, that if you have an officer who has mischaracterized information, they should not take the witness stand. And if they cannot take the witness stand, they cannot be promoted in a lot of contexts, because you have to be able to take the witness stand in a major drug investigation or murder investigation. And so if you can't do that, you can't be a detective, essentially. So law enforcement doesn't like this level of scrutiny. But what we've heard from state's attorneys is that they feel like there are times when their chiefs of police say, I can't believe you put that in the file, and act like it's a subjective decision. What this would do is take any subjectivity out of the decision and make that database searchable and accessible by all state's attorneys and to our criminal justice counsel as they look into questions of investigations of misconduct or, any investigation they're doing into law enforcement. I guess the question could arise, should it be public to everyone? Eventually, I think that step could be taken when this becomes of a quality where people don't feel like there are, mistakes or oversights in what's put into the file. But we do know that many law enforcement agencies and state's attorneys are glad to have this because they may not know about someone who is accused of misconduct or has something in their file in another agency, and they may be new to this agency and have never known that this person had some misconduct that was questionable. So it really is a transparency measure. It keeps law enforcement who do engage in misconduct or misclassification of information from being promoted, and it helps with hiring decisions and just better access to justice. And so the last major piece is newer to a lot of states. I think so much of our law enforcement law seems to be based on like what we think happens on Law and Order. If you may have noticed this, and there's we all think like, oh yeah, they're gonna tell the person that they've gotten someone else and someone's confessed, and then they're gonna get that person to confess to the whole crime, and everything's the end, happy ending. Often those deceptive tactics, telling someone that someone has told on them, creating a false narrative around committing a crime, telling them there's evidence that doesn't exist, leads to false confessions, and it leads to false confessions more often with youth. And so I tried to ban the use of all false and coercive tactics in interrogations. Then I tried to just do it for young people. And then we said we ran out of time, and we ended up studying the whole thing. I do think there's room to ban the use of false information for youth, particularly this year, if the committee in the House was willing to take more testimony than we could. At the last minute, law enforcement said, yeah, but what about, people pretending to be a 14-year-old, talking to another 14-year-old, and they're trying to investigate child predators. Well, this is about custodial interrogations when you pull someone off the street for questioning. It has nothing to do with that kind of investigation. So we felt like law enforcement really threw some red herrings out there on this one at the 11th hour. And that was frustrating, but we just didn't have time to recover from that and keep the bill strong. The other thing I will say is a lot of people on the floor said, oh, but are we doing this? State police have generally used the peace technique, which is considered a best practice. And as we were having the discussion, we learned that in South Burlington, they advertised a training in what's called the Reed technique. And the Reed technique is banned in many European countries and in many states, because it essentially is that law and order idea of how you engage in an interrogation, that you would create a narrative that creates guilt around the person, and then ask them to fill in the blanks around their own guilt. And so you're encouraged to tell a story about how all the evidence fits together to demonstrate the person's guilt. And then they are essentially asked to defend themselves, or to, you're essentially asking them questions like, isn't that why that happened? And, don't you, isn't that why you did this? And then see if you think they're lying or not. It's incredibly subjective. It's banned in many places. And it was advertised as a training out of South Burlington just in the last few weeks. So, there is reason to be concerned that local law enforcement is still using these tactics. So, I think we could go further, particularly on that piece in the House, but that is S-250, and I at least hope it passes in the Senate. They know that they have someone watchdogging these in the Senate, and me. And, I know we have great champions for these kinds of issues in the House, but, they may be thinking they can, law enforcement may be thinking they can water the bill down further over there. Speaking of watering down bills, S-254 started out as legislation to end the doctrine of qualified immunity for law enforcement. And it's something that 75% of Vermonters support. And it creates access to the courts for victims related to law enforcement. And, if anything, in my view, it ends a lot of the large settlements to just ask an officer to leave who may have killed someone or engaged in misconduct. And we were not able to get that legislation across the finish line this year. Instead, it's a study of ending qualified immunity. Honestly, the biggest issue we heard from law enforcement is we're having a hard time recruiting now, and this will make it harder. Well, I don't think we want people who go around violating people's civil rights and potentially causing injury or death to be the majority of who makes up our law enforcement. And as I said, we have nurses and teachers, telling us they have a worker shortage too. We're not telling them just lower your standards, just don't work as hard to teach our kids well, or take care of patients as well in the hospital. We maintain our standards. And this is an area where, I think we can do a lot better to ensure that we hold law enforcement accountable to the law. What we did do is a study and essentially to codify the Zulo ruling and make it apply to more than the state police, but the entire state. So local law enforcement as well, that there is no immunity from liability when you violate the Vermont Constitution. And, at least in the Zulo case, as people may know, and I talked to Mr. Zulo and got a quote for him for the floor, talking about how much it would mean to him to end qualified immunity. But, he was a young man at 21 at the time, who was pulled over for having snow on his license plate near Castleton, where he was enrolled. And when the law enforcement officer said they smelled a hint of marijuana and asked to search the car, Mr. Zulo refused. They took his vehicle and impounded it, and he walked many miles in the dark on the side of a country road back to the campus. And to me, that's just an example of how often, young people of color, young Black men particularly, are dehumanized in these situations. I said, what parent would want their child to stay at a college, in a town, or in a state where that happened to them, where they could have been hit by a car or or they could have been died of hypothermia? A number of things could have happened. And, these kinds of things cannot stand. And thankfully the Supreme Court agreed. But, violating the Vermont Constitution is still different than maintaining that an officer has a very wide range of discretion to make these decisions, when, as you may know, 75% of everyone pulled over in Bennington recently was a Black man. In Brattleboro, you are 9 times more likely to be pulled over and have your vehicle searched if you are a Black man. Black individuals are still 2 to 3 times more likely to be stopped and searched, and much less likely to have any contraband found in their vehicle, or anything illegal. Closer to home, people may know in Chittenden County, it really keeps me up at night that young Black men make up 2.5% of our youth population, but 25% of those charged as youthful offenders. It is a dramatic overrepresentation. And, we are, as I experienced when I was 13, after an experience like that, you just think, well, if people believe I'm a criminal, then maybe that's what I'll be. So, without, short of ending qualified immunity and hopefully passing the other bill, we just hear from law enforcement, you're making our jobs harder. No one wants to be a law enforcement officer. Well, we really need to rethink public safety, both for the benefit of law enforcement, and for the benefit of all involved. And so that in Vermont, where 90% of our population growth has come from the in-migration of people of color, we're not criminalizing people before we can welcome them, and make them feel like a valued part of our state. So that's what I wanted to say. I knew I was going to go over. I'm so sorry. I try not to go deep down these rabbit holes, but I can stay on for a little longer if it's okay with folks. But I did take up your time that you may want for other things.
No, actually, our time is yours, really. We would love to, we're so glad and so thankful that you're here. And if people have questions, I think that Riley had mentioned that might be something we could do after you presented this information.
Yes, I will stay for as many questions as people have, and that might help us get further into how people can help, or strategy of various kinds. And if folks want to introduce themselves too when they speak. Patty, I see your hand. I should probably look for hands.
Our group, Richmond Racial Equity, is right now in the process of trying to figure out data collection and reporting from our police. We've over the years, we've had data presented, and it's always very difficult to weed through it. There's just a lot of stuff, and you might not know. There might be one incident, but there might be 12 things written down, and it's very difficult to get a handle on it. And I'm just wondering, you know, so it's wonderful that we're adding more things besides traffic stops, and that's awesome. And I want to really hope that moves through the House and stays intact. But I'm just wondering, like, have you thought about, or do you know of any way that the data can be not just collected, but also in a format that's accessible to people? We'd like it accessible on our town website. We want people to be able to sort through it. We want the Justice Center that just did a report for you guys to be able to get the information they want easily.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up. And the S250 does specifically say it has to be easy to liberate and easy to understand by the public. And I have to say, I try to give law enforcement credit where I can. And the state police have a really easily discernible dashboard, though I have found flaws in sort of how the information is presented and how easy it is to truly understand what you're looking at. But they are very far along, and there are, I think, about 11 different systems for collecting the data overall in the state, and they are working to streamline that. So they wouldn't let me put a time frame around that, because as you can appreciate, every year we say, is the data any better? And it's a little bit better. But it's we have really put in the bill, this can't just be hand over a pile of papers. This has to be easy to access and understand by the public. And I think that's a new pathway in our policy that we've really had to emphasize. And, it's frustrating that on the one hand, I think there are delay tactics and, getting people information that's hard to discern or requires a PhD does delay understanding it. And at the same time, we also know that there are lots of local law enforcement agencies that don't have the resources to do this well. And I had a place like, I had communities like Richmond in mind when I asked that we use 25% of cannabis revenue to help smaller communities fund these kinds of initiatives, to fund conversations. It shouldn't just be, places that have a large tax base like a Burlington or a Montpelier, where I have done equity work, that can afford to have long processes with consultants and feed people and compensate people to join oversight boards. All of our communities, and particularly, when you look at Chittenden County, communities like Williston and Richmond that are trying to do the work but might not have, necessarily the population that says, sure, spend $50,000 on that, need revenue and support from the state to be able to have these conversations. It shouldn't be a privilege to have a better data and a better conversation between communities and law enforcement. Thanks, Patty. Yes, Representative Brown.
Thanks, Kesha. I just wanted to say thank you so much for that really clear presentation on these bills. That's really appreciated, and I think I definitely learned some things that hadn't sort of risen to the top of my mind before. So really appreciate that. I think particularly with the environmental justice bill, in terms of really examining the workplace aspect of that. That wasn't sort of that angle on the issue, wasn't something that I had really considered before. So, and then, in terms of not just identifying areas of accumulated burden, but also areas where there's a serious lack of benefit. So really appreciate that. And, really appreciate letting folks know sort of honestly the sort of tangled path these bills can take inside the legislature. So, absolutely, when these, when these bills sit in the House, we need to be reaching out to folks, your local legislator, people who are sitting on those committees, to make sure that this really thoughtful work gets the consideration it deserves.
Thanks so much, Jana. Representative, there's just a couple of things I want to say in response. One of the things that really gelled for me understanding the environmental justice movement was in high school. I was working on a project to support cleaner air in Los Angeles. And, you know, we were working on getting rid of a particular chemical called perchloroethylene in dry cleaning. It's very carcinogenic, it affects the workers, and it stays in the soil and the groundwater. And all of a sudden they said, okay, well, now we need you to interpret all of this into you know, a couple of different Korean languages and talk to the Korean community. It's like, oh, why? I don't get it. And, you know, Korean immigrants own 2/3 of the dry cleaning establishments in Los Angeles. So you have to really think, okay, are we bulldozing over a population that wants to have better health, that know that their family members are dying young, but we're also taking away their livelihood. So how do we create loans and grants and bridge programs and phase the chemical out rather than just shame people and take their livelihood away? So absolutely, you know, appreciate you talking about workplace or highlighting the workplace issues. And we joke in the legislature, or we at least did when I was in the House, you know, the other party is just the opposition. It's the other chamber that's the enemy. So, you know, I'm sure the House is mad at the Senate for all kinds of things. I was just giving you my perspective on some of our bills and, you know, ways that I hope they remain the same in the House, but also ways the House can improve on our work because the Senate often runs out of time, and that's usually a poor excuse for doing poor work. So hoping the Senate can help us out. I mean, the House can help us out here in the Senate. Jeff, nice to see you.
Well, yeah, nice to see you too, Kesha. And really happy that you're able to spend time with us here in Richmond. It's really great. I had two questions. One was, you know, the workplace that springs to mind for me in Vermont would be the dairy industry. And I wonder if there was pushback from the dairy industry on some of the workplace issues. And the second question I have is, you know, has the governor stated any position on these bills? Is there any veto threat for either of these bills?
That's a great, those are great questions. You know, I feel like if the dairy industry knew more about the environmental justice bill, they might have opposed it. You know, we often, I mean, I remember about a decade ago when I wrote the human trafficking bill in the state, the agricultural sector was worried about the bill because they said what we do looks like labor trafficking. You know, we worry that saying that people have the right to X, Y, or Z can end up affecting our industry. And so we know we have a lot of work to do to not overburden our farmers as we try to work with farm workers to have their basic rights and needs met. So that's always a frightening prospect. I think with the farm worker community, we see a lot of attempts to address environmental injustices in a range of different bills in addition to this one. So, you know, migrant farm worker housing, et cetera. But we had a bill that was making its way through the legislature about tenant protections, and it excluded farm worker housing. And the farm worker community came to us and said, why would we be excluded? Oh, because we give you $1 million to work on housing issues. Well, that shouldn't exclude people from having their rights and needs met. So we often face a lot of different whack-a-mole places where environmental injustices specific to the migrant farm worker community, ways that they're left out of legislation in an effort to protect our dairy farmers. You know, those kinds of things can be really damaging. So we're constantly trying to be vigilant about that. And migrant justice definitely needs help and champions who they can go to and say, why again are we left out or put in a certain way that singles out the farm worker community for a loss of rights and access to health.
And my second question was about the governor.
The veto. Feels like the governor might veto everything. You know, I think 3 bills out of my committee have been vetoed already. I'm not trying to smile about that. It's a really interesting year. I think we've seen more vetoes in this biennium, you know, than in almost any other. And the governor has taken to keeping his cards really close to his chest. You know, I can appreciate and understand that, but I've been doing this for a decade. It also helps when we try to address those concerns on the front end rather than after, you know, a veto is issued. I cannot see him vetoing the environmental justice bill because we are so overdue from the orders of the EPA, from civil rights perspective on this bill, unless he had a very good reason and had the blessing of this EPA, which I can't imagine. Vermont will now be one of the last states in the country otherwise not to have an environmental justice policy on the books. We're one of about 8 states left. Maine is slated to craft, that's the only other New England state that doesn't have an environmental justice policy. We're both slated to pass one this year. I have heard his own ANR staff say this is the most must-pass bill they can think of in a long time for the agency. So I really hope not, but I am biased. And with the policing things, I think there's those bills, I do think there's a good chance of that qualified immunity was going to get vetoed S-254. I think there's even a chance that S-254 as a study and as a principled stance will get vetoed. I think S-250, because law enforcement did not actively oppose it, has the possibility of being signed or allowed to become law without the governor's signature. Yeah, Bonnie.
Oh, thank you so much. I am wondering what we can do to help. I'm curious about kind of next steps. I'm hoping that if you do have to hop off this call, that those of us that stay behind can perhaps have a conversation about how to implement some advocacy work.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, Representative Brown will know probably as much as I do about pressure points and personalities on the House side. You know, it's just been a few years for me, but if you do know folks on the House Natural Resources Committee, I'm trying to think who in Jim McCullough has been a huge champion for this bill. So I want to start by saying that, Representative McCullough on natural resources is really helping to champion this bill. The advocates have felt the same way. He still benefits from more information. Another piece that's perplexed the committee is the idea that we've created a map where 55% of the population would be eligible for greater access to amenities and benefits because they're currently the more distressed communities. And we also mapped that against civil rights protected classes and lower household income communities. So we said, where are there hazards and environmental distresses? And where are there people who lack English language proficiency, people of color, and people below median household income in a large chunk of their community? And we've come up with a map that starts there and looks at those communities getting more environmental resources. And when you look at the map, it's the places we all knew had more environmental distress. It's the Rutlands, it's the Benningtons, it's the Northeast Kingdoms, and it's the high concentration places of renters and people of color. And so, we're trying to make sure that they don't reduce the thresholds or change that fundamental piece of how you map distress against, people who lack political power, essentially. So even Jim has sort of said, I need to understand this better. And so we're just trying to give as much information as we can and keep the committee curious and focused on, the language being really important to impacted communities. So I'm trying to think of others from Chittenden County who might be on that committee, but thank Jim and, help him stay strong. And then if you know anybody else on that committee or want to write to that committee, that would help. I should have checked to see, so in the Senate, because I'm such a strong advocate for policing issues and I serve on government operations, which can take over policing issues because it deals with local government. My S-250 policing bill came out of our government operations committee. I will double check and tell, and if, I don't expect Representative Brown to know this, but I'll figure out where S-250 went. And S-254 all but likely went to Senate Judiciary. So, passing at least S-254, I don't know that for example, Representative Martin Lalonde from South Burlington, I want to give him some credit. He's looked into qualified immunity as a path to greater policing oversight and closing disparities. He feels really strongly that you can't end qualified immunity. So I don't think we're going to, and he's an important player on judiciary. I don't think we're going to get a stronger bill, just knowing who's on the committee and general prevailing attitudes and the threat of the governor's veto. But if we could at least maintain what we have, a study of ending qualified immunity and the codification of the Zullo case for local law enforcement, that is still a step forward. It's something that ACLU, the Ben and Jerry's of the world, people appreciate as a step forward. And so S250, Riley has let me know, is in judiciary as well. I didn't think it would go to GovOps. I think that was just a special dispensation for me being on Senate GovOps. But in House Judiciary, they also have this bill where I think they could take more time and consideration for how do we strengthen protections against deceptive interrogation techniques and reduce the use of those for youth, especially where we know in Chittenden County, where we know there's unfavorable practices being used. There's also a high rate of disparity with who among the youth population are being incarcerated or detained. So I think it is an important provision to work on. I think I learned that from other states that youth are 2 to 3 times more likely to confess involuntarily when presented with false information. So, they're very susceptible to just not wanting to be in trouble or reducing the amount of trouble that they're in. And so many states have started to ban that practice.
I was really disappointed to hear you say that South Burlington has just recently had this be something that they were touting. We had, my cat's meowing. We had heard that the chief of police in South Burlington was actually a person who could, even show some mentorship to other police departments in terms of his stance on biased policing and racial equity issues. So that was just really disappointing. That's disappointing for me to hear, but maybe they're just not connecting the dots.
Yeah, I will put in the chat, by the own website of the READ technique, they talk about first you create this narrative based on whatever information. Ooh, that's kind of a weird looking link. You create this narrative and then you fit all the pieces together and create your case. I mean, it's there when you go to their website, it says protecting the innocent and identifying the guilty in huge letters. It feels very Law and Order, idea of how this works. And it is a banned practice. And it was the Attorney General's office, which it's been great. They have a lot of expertise, Julio Thompson of the Civil Rights Division on this issue. And he pointed that out, that it was a training in South Burlington for any law enforcement that wanted to participate and get credit, and that it was then advertised by the state on our Criminal Justice Council website. So there's been no quality control, even at the state level, of what they are advertising on behalf of local law enforcement. Jeff, yeah.
Well, I'm sorry to jump in again, but I wonder if you've worked with Sarah George at all. She's the Chittenden County State's Attorney.
Oh, I know Sarah. Yeah.
And my understanding is that she is a very progressive prosecutor in the country.
Yes, I am a huge Sarah George fan. We sat down and I gave her my full list. Here are all the things I want to do in this bill, and it was a bigger bill. And she supported, I believe all of it, or a vast majority. And she really felt particularly the Giglio registry piece would be extremely helpful. There is a lot of, and other states' attorneys who said, I don't really want to testify, but this would make a difference. We are pressured by our local chiefs of police to leave things out of the file. And now we can say this is, it was already in the rules, but not in statute, that it's discoverable by the defense, and therefore it's essentially against the law not to include that information. So while it's a Supreme Court case, while it was in the rules, it had never been codified, and many states' attorneys have said this helps them keep those files far more accurate. So Sarah George really led the way. You can Google, it's here, but if I can't find it right away, this is how you spell it, Giglio. It looks like Giglio. And Vermont Digger did a 3-part series out of Rutland about why Giglio files are so important, and why there's such a battle over keeping information out of them for law enforcement. And so, I was grateful that law enforcement didn't necessarily fight it, but they did. I'm remembering this now. They did say, we have a few technical changes we'd like to make here, just so there's a very limited scope of people who can look at what's in the file at the Criminal Justice Council level. And so that did raise a flag for me. So I will be following up. But, there is what we've experienced with law enforcement, and I work with a lot of them, and I sit down with them before and try to build that trust, because I always say to them, if law enforcement doesn't have trust, we don't have safe communities. And so I'm trying to help people trust you more, and that requires that all communities feel protected and served by you. And so, with that, I've talked to them about a lot of these things. They'll say, yeah, we get it. This is so important. We just have one little technical change we want to make. And unless we're watching really carefully what that is, it does feel like it really tends to water down these provisions. So I am trying to figure out what they want to change to the Giglio registry in.
It seems to me that, the state's attorney is kind of an obscure elected office that many people don't know that you vote for them, don't know what they do or who they are. And my understanding is she's going to get a primary challenge. And so something that we might want to do is pay attention to that race. There won't be many people voting in that primary for that office. And from everything that I've heard about, and she'll get attacked as being soft on crime.
Yeah.
She's made some controversial decisions on what not to prosecute, and yet I think she's really one of the most progressive prosecutors in the country.
I'm so glad you said that, Jeff. I couldn't agree more. And that, there's other big races going on, and people might not be paying as close attention to that one, and that would harm her. I think if people are paying attention, they know Sarah George, they respect the integrity of her work. But if that sort of flies under the radar, then there is a danger there, and it's going to take some folks paying attention. And she's really put herself on the line. Absolutely. She's been attacked by several mayors and, law enforcement officers. And then when she does defend law enforcement, sometimes she gets attacked by the community for defending law enforcement. So, she often can't win. But I really do, I've known her since I was the legal director of our Steps to End Domestic Violence program in the county. And she was in the state's attorney's office helping victims of domestic violence. And she really knows from both sides, what victims truly need to feel whole and safe. And so often that's not locking someone behind bars and throwing away the key forever. And she really gets, all angles from the bottom of her heart. So I plug for Sarah George. Please do help and support her in the primary. This is an endorsement, I suppose. I really am a fan. Oh, Wafiq, hi. Sorry, yeah, I stopped paying attention to the.
Thank you, Kesha. Good to have you here. My question is, every kind of law have been created for oversight over the policing, like Act 54, etc. It talks about education and retraining and racial sensitivity, racial equity, and all the good stuff. But who can oversight all this training when you get surprised of South Burlington and another, when they tell you, yes, we are doing a training or this? Why we don't overlook over the training? What kind of a training we need the police? Because frankly, all these laws we are passing, the system, which is somebody like me consider it racist system, already 2 steps in front of us. And the oversight on the state police, which is you praised earlier, and I was in many meetings on that, the oversight in Waterbury, it is still controlled by the states and the ex-chief of police, ex-judges, which is they have 1 million question mark over them. They are the problem. We struggled to do Act 54. So where are we going with this?
Yeah, it's a great question, Rafiq, and it allows me to talk about two pieces of S250 that got taken out of the bill that I was really frustrated to see disappear. Again, I was told there wasn't enough time, and one of them was independent investigation into use of force that results in injury or death. Right now, we do a sort of larger look back review, conduct review of an officer, but when an incident happens where there's a serious injury or loss of life, there is no investigation that automatically kicks in. And the challenge I faced with trying to define independent was, who is best equipped to do that investigation? Where is it housed? Do we hire people from, from state law enforcement or outside of the state to do the investigation? Right now, when the Criminal Justice Council even does a conduct review for an officer, they might have people conducting that review who came from the same department, came from the same county, and that doesn't seem particularly independent. To me, that was raised in the case of former Representative Kaya Morris. She asked for a fair review of the Bennington Police Department and did not get that. Got a lot of people from Bennington reviewing it and saying everything was fine. And that pushes people further toward the Human Rights Commission, which is an incredible resource in the state. But then they issue findings that say the state police were wrong in the case of the Clemens family farm, or the state police or the local police acted wrongly in a certain case. And then law enforcement says, well, they're a quasi-judicial body, and that wasn't done in the sort of in the best way possible. So people of color often have nowhere to go where they feel like they can air their grievances. I have pointed this out to our Commissioner of Public Safety. If you go on the state police website, you will see that if you have a complaint you want filed, it just goes into the general bureaucratic system, and you may or may not hear back in 6 months about any if there were any findings of misconduct in that case. You will only know in a very general sense if officers were disciplined. And this is the commissioner saying, I'm doing this out of the goodness of my own heart. It's not required. And so I'm saying, well, I want to start requiring it. People should know where to go to file a complaint, how to get help, and that complaint is being addressed and how. And they are not at this point inviting anything close to that kind of scrutiny, which has been really frustrating. The independent investigation piece did get stripped out of the bill. And the frustrating part for me was I just didn't know where I felt like we could house independent investigation. And that brings me to the second piece that was stripped out. The Attorney General's office wanted to have the authority to look into pattern and practice issues. So if there's a department, I'm going to use Bennington as an example because there's been a lot of complaints about the Bennington Police Department. If they wanted to investigate the pattern and practice that's leading to so many disparities in arrest or disparities in treatment, they would have to, they don't have that authority right now, and they wanted to have that authority. That was taken out of the bill. But at the same time, the Attorney General's office won't investigate pattern or practice with the state police or with even, with fish and wildlife, wardens and things like that, because they are their clients. So, the challenge is while you can get some value out of the AG's office in looking at what's going on with local police, their job is to defend the state police against scrutiny. So, these challenges have not been resolved, and we started to look at other states and how they try to get some independence in their investigations and oversight. And it's not easy, but I was frustrated that those two pieces got cut out instead of us trying to dig in and figure out how to get them right. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We greatly appreciate your time this evening. This has been incredibly informative, and I know that folks who have, what we were hoping, the Richmond Racial Equity folks, is that we might be able to form some connections with people from other communities, and we were going to break out into small groups, but I think given the time, perhaps if people could just put their contact information if they haven't already in the chat, so we can save that. And especially make note if you are a person who might like to work, collaboratively in the future and to, come together to further push this work and other work forward. And so again, thank you so much, Kesha, for coming. Really, really appreciate your work.
Thank you. I feel like I took up too much time, but it's so hard to fit 10 years of work on
No, are
these.
you kidding me? You didn't take up too much time at all. No, you are the reason we're here, to hear what you had to say and to learn. So I really appreciate that, as we all do.
And I just want to say again, Richmond and your work has stood out as above and beyond. And, I know there's just a couple other people of color on this call, but it really does make a huge difference. Just to know that there are people in the community fighting so you don't have to, because it can result in such a loss of reputation or opportunity when you are that person of color. So you are really just flanking people who need that help, and you're making our state a better and safer place as we grow in our racial diversity. So thank you.
I'd just like to say, I just put my email into the chat, and anyone that's on this call, especially from other towns that haven't been, we haven't connected yet. I would be really welcoming if you would like to email me so that I can know who might like to connect on some actions and initiatives around these things. We might want to do something to help Sarah George. We might want to contact the people that are on these committees where these bills are going and so forth. So if anybody would like to do further work, please, it says it's brushit55@gmail.com. It's in the chat. Just copy it and send me a note, and I can gather a group together for those that want to take action.
You're an awesome bunch. I'll let you keep putting your emails, and, thank you. And with Sarah George and other elections, this Chittenden County is going to have different Senate seats, and it's going to open up a lot of turn and opportunity. And these issues should be on the agenda, as I know you will make them. And, it's just an exciting time to ask candidates and hold them accountable to these kinds of initiatives and issues. So with that, I'll say goodbye, and thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
So much.
Everyone.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you for coming.